The report lay on my desk. The words were printed there in stark black ink. Domestic disturbance, 14 Seabird Lane, Cormorant's Perch Island, and below were the names, Elias and Ilara Vance. A domestic on the perch? That's a new one, I said, and the springs of my chair groaned under my weight. They usually handle their own business. Sergeant O'Malley worked his crossword and did not look up. He had a face creased with a permanent judgment against the world and all its doings. Noise complaint came from their nearest neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, said they were going at it loud enough to scare the gulls off his roof. A lot of smashing, apparently. The Vances haven't been answering the line since. He raised his head, and in his eyes you could see the pale, flat blue of a winter sky over a dead ocean. You're up, Harper. Me? Don't you think sending a familiar face like Gibbs might be better? Those folks are particular. Gibbs has got a multi-car pile-up on the causeway, O'Malley said, and you need to learn how to deal with the particulars if you ever want to make a career in this coastal jurisdiction. It's just a lover's quarrel. Go over there, knock some heads, tell 'em to keep it down, and be back before lunch. He nodded with his chin toward the pistol on my hip. And you know the islanders' rules about mainland formalities. Leave that here, it spooks them. You want me to go to an island known for its hostility to outsiders to mediate a potentially violent domestic dispute, unarmed? It's not hostile, it's private, he said. And they're not savages, Alex. They're fishermen and farmers who want to be left alone. A uniform is authority enough. Now go. I rose and unclipped the sidearm from my belt. The island was a 20-minute boat ride from mainland. The 100 or so that lived there lived by their own reckonings. They schooled their children in a one-room house and sent them out onto the water when they came of age. They bartered, and they kept to themselves, and they only crossed to the mainland for what the island couldn't provide. They had their own laws and an old man to speak them, and for their trouble to find its way to our desks on the mainland meant the trouble was serious. The deck of the ferry was cold beneath my feet. A low grey mist lay upon the water and shrouded all things from sight. It muffled the drone of the engine and swallowed the world until the mainland dissolved into a smear of grey behind us. The perch grew out of the void ahead, a dark upthrust of rock and pine that clawed at the sky. Then you could see the houses, bleached white things that clung to the stone or clustered near the harbour like sea foam caught in a crevice. An old woman sat hunched on a bench in a thick wool shawl. She was the only other soul aboard, and she looked at the water and not at me, and she did not speak. When the ferry groaned and nudged the dock timbers, I was the only one to stand. I stepped onto the wet wood, and the air was another air altogether. The salt of it, and the reek of pine, and the smoke of wood fires burning somewhere beyond the stony rise. An older quiet was here. No sound of cars, no human call, just the wind and the gulls. Some men in oilskins and heavy sweaters worked on nets by a beached boat. Their hands moved with a slowness that bespoke a world without clocks. They stopped their work to watch me come ashore, and their eyes read the blue uniform, and then they turned away. No word. I looked at a faded map that was nailed to a post by the dock. Seabird Lane was at the far end of the village, and I set out on that path. The houses were old things built to stand against the wind and the sea, scrubbed clean against the rot, and nets lay draped on fences like grave shrouds. There were gardens starved by the salt wind, but still showing color. I saw faces in the dark glass of windows, pale specters that watched my passing and then were gone. And then I saw the house, 14 Seabird Lane. It was a cottage like the others, but set apart from them. In the garden, a clay pot lay shattered upon the stone walk, and its dark soil was spilled out amongst the ruin of red flowers. Through a window left open to the wind, I could hear the sounds, a man's low rumble and a woman's sharp answer. They were still at it. I drew a lungful of cold air to ready myself, and I knocked my fist against the door. Inside, all sound stopped. A long quiet. Then the door groaned on its hinges and opened into the dark of the house. The man who stood in the doorframe was a wall of bulk and weathered hide that filled the space of the door. He wore a beard, and his hands were the size of quarry stones, stained about the quicks of his nails with a blackness like engine grease or old blood. This would be Elias Vance. His eyes held a hard light, but when they fell upon the blue of my uniform, some of that light seemed to fail, leaving behind what might have been shame or only surprise. In the dimness of the house beyond him, a woman stood with her arms crossed over her. Her hair was red, and it was twisted up in a knot at the back of her head. On the floorboards near her feet lay a broken plate. "Elias Vance," I said. "I'm Detective Alex Harper from the mainland precinct. We received a complaint about a disturbance." He gave a noise in his throat that was not a word and stepped back from the door. I entered into a smell of brine and stewed herbs, and some other scent beneath that was the scent of the house itself, of old wood and old sorrows. The space was neat, except for the evidence of their war. The broken plate, a stool overturned on its side, and on the stairs that climbed into the darkness of the second floor, a boy sat watching us with wide and unnervingly still eyes. "There's no need for mainland business here," Ilara Vance said. "My husband and I were having a private discussion. That gossip Hemlock should learn to mind his own business. A discussion that involves breaking things and shouting loud enough for your neighbors to hear is no longer private, ma'am," I said. "I do not want to put this in a report. I only want to know what happened and see that everyone is okay. Is anyone hurt?" Elias stared at the floorboards, and his jaw was tight. It was the woman who spoke. "He gets these fits of temper. It's how he is. He believes I am careless." "Careless with what?" I asked. "With our traditions," Elias said. His voice was a low rumble from the pit of his chest. "She forgets the importance of things. She becomes lenient." His eyes were on her then, a look that was not simple anger, but a deeper and more searing judgment, as if she had broken some covenant between them. "The traditions haven't kept our stores full for the winter, have they?" she said. "Sometimes you have to adapt. Be practical." All right, I said, holding up my hands, as if to ward off a blow. "Look, I can tell you're both passionate people. I'm not here to take sides or to pry into your island ways. I'm only here to make sure disagreements don't become dangerous. Has there been any physical violence?" "Elias, did you lay a hand on your wife?" "Never," he said. He looked at me as if the question itself were the offense. "I would never harm Ilara." "And you, Ilara?" I asked, turning to her. "Did you feel threatened?" She drew a breath, and her gaze moved from my face to her husband's and back again, as if weighing two different kinds of trouble. "He is loud," she said. "But other than that, no, detective. He did not hurt me." "Then I am calling it a quarrel that went past its bounds," I said. "But I will have to file a minor report. You should know that, if we are called back to this house for this reason, the law will take a harder hand. Do you understand?" They both gave a short, silent nod. The fury had not left the room, but it had drawn back into the corners. A strange and weary quiet took its place. Elias went to the spot on the floor, and he knelt, and with his great hands began to gather the larger shards of the plate. The woman watched him for a long moment, and a look passed over her face that I could not read, and then she turned and went into the kitchen, and I heard the scrape of a kettle being set upon the stove. I was scratching a note in my book when I felt the weight of his stare. The boy on the stairs had not moved. He sat pale in the gloom and lost inside his clothes. His eyes were like holes burned in a blanket. The argument had taken root in him in a way it had not in his parents. The peace had been made, such as it was. I could take the afternoon ferry back across the water and set the strange accounting of it down on paper. I snapped the book shut, and I slipped the weight of it into my coat. The woman Ilara returned from the darkness of the kitchen. She would not meet my eye, but looked instead toward her husband, as he stood like a beast of burden by the door. "Elias, fetch some driftwood for the evening fire," she said, and her voice was not a wife's request, but a command given to dismiss him from her sight, so she might offer up some parting lie of peace before sending me from her house. Elias looked at me a final time, and the storm was still in his face, but he gave a curt nod of his head and turned, and was gone out the back door into the grey light. When he was gone, it was as if some great weight had been lifted from the low timbers of that house. "Thank you for your visit, Detective Harper," Elias said, and her voice was softer now. "I am sorry for the trouble." "It's no trouble at all, ma'am. I just want to ensure things remain peaceful here. I said, and I moved toward the door. Domestic disputes can be unsettling for everyone, especially children. I turned my head to where the boy still sat on the stairs. Is he doing all right? Finn is a sensitive boy, she said, and she made a gesture with her hand as if shooing a fly, as if his nature were a defect she had learned to abide. He has an active imagination. As I stood on the threshold, I felt a sudden and urgent claim on the hem of my coat. I turned, and the boy was there. He stood behind me with a strange look on his face. He looked past me into the house to where his mother worked by the hearth, and he made sure she was not looking. I need to tell you something, he whispered. I crouched down and looked into his face. What is it, Finn? You can tell me. He leaned to me, and his hand was a small cold fist, clenching the cloth of my jacket. His eyes were wild with a terror that had no place in the heart of a child. They're not fighting about what you think, he whispered. It's about people from the mainland. It's always about them. What about them, Finn? He swallowed, and his gaze flew to the gray and twisted trees. Then he leaned so close, his lips were nearly at my ear. My mum and dad, he said. They eat them. They eat people from the mainland. The words landed in the plain air, and they meant nothing. The notion of it. Cannibalism. On an island a stone's throw from a modern American town. It was preposterous. It had to be a child's interpretation of something ugly he'd heard. I set the words aside, as you would a piece of stone that did not fit the wall you were building. I reached out, and with a gentle pull, I loosened his hand from my coat. I gave him a smile. Hey, it's all right, I said. Grown-ups say some pretty scary-sounding things when they're angry, don't they? Sometimes it sounds like they could eat each other alive. It's just an expression. It doesn't mean it's real. Your parents love you, and they don't eat anyone, I promise. But the boy was not comforted. He looked at me, and his face collapsed into a mask of pure and desolating grief. It was the look of a true believer who has been met with apostasy. The tears stood in his eyes, but did not fall. No, he whispered, you don't understand. You don't understand. He turned from me then and fled, his small feet in their socks making no sound on the wood of the floor, and he was gone up the stairs into the shadows of the house. I stood and turned my back. I had done my work here. It was time to leave this quiet desolation and return to the mainland, where things could be measured and made sense of. I began to walk, but the boy's whisper went with me. It was a stubborn and unwelcome shadow that the sun could not burn away. The boy's words had planted a seed of disquiet in my mind, and while I told myself that this was a child's fiction born from a house of unhappy truth, reason would not set my heart at ease. I told myself that the human mind will invent monsters to explain the sorrows of the world, for the monsters can be slain. I was halfway to the ferry landing, where the grey water lapped at the timbers of the dock, when a voice called out to me, a voice rich and warm. Detective, a moment, if you would be so kind. I turned and saw an old man seated upon a bench that had been hewn from a single great log of driftwood. He had a beard that flowed down his chest, white as sea foam, and his eyes were a startling and brilliant blue. In his hands he held a piece of wood and a small knife, and from the wood he was coaxing the shape of a bird. His smile was not like the other faces I had seen here. It was a true and genuine thing that creased the old map of his face, and it was a thing that could disarm a man before he knew he had been armed. He radiated a calm and settled authority. This was the island's elder. "Good day, sir," I said, and I walked to where he sat. "Detective Alex Harper. You must be Malachi." "Indeed I am," he replied. His voice was a deep and comforting burr. "And I would guess, from the grim set of your shoulders as you arrived, and the slightly less troubled look upon you now, that you have successfully poured oil on the troubled waters at the Vance household." "Something like that," I said. "It seems to have been settled for the time being. Hopefully they'll keep it down from now on." "Elias has a hard head, and Elara a sharp tongue," Malachi said, and he chuckled low in his chest as his knife continued its deft and practiced work. "It is an unfortunate pairing of temperaments at times, but their hearts are true to our ways. We are grateful you made the trip, detective. It relieves me of having to deliver a harsher island judgment." He stopped his work then and looked up at me, and his gaze was both kind and possessed of a deep and knowing power. "But you look weary from your journey. You are already headed back to the mainland then. What a pity. Well, my work here is done," and I let the words fall away, for I would not tell this man that his island had creeped me out. "But your visit is so short," Malachi exclaimed, and a look of true disappointment crossed his face. "You mainlanders are always in such a rush. You never stop to truly see our little world. It truly is a shame, because you arrive on our shores at a most auspicious time. Our annual Harvest Festival is in just 2 days." He said the words Harvest Festival as if they were a benediction, and his eyes took on a light of deep and holy reverence. "It is the highlight of our year," he said, "a celebration of the sea's bounty, the season's turn. There is music, dancing, a great feast. It is a spectacle I assure you cannot be found anywhere on your side of the water, a real piece of living history." A curiosity rose in me against my better judgment. It was a lure, and I was a fish rising to it. "A festival, you say? I suppose I could stay. I do have a couple of personal days I could take." A beatific smile bloomed upon Malachi's face. "Excellent. I would consider it a personal honor and a wonderful gesture of goodwill between the Perch and the mainland authorities. It shows us you care beyond the matters of law enforcement. Please, stay as our guest." He pointed with the tip of his knife down a path that led away from the dock. "Old Martha runs a small guest house just off the cove, the Mariner's Rest. She will make you feel right at home. I will inform her to expect you." The offer was warm and heartfelt. It smothered the last of the boy's dark whisper. The elder himself was inviting me. This was the path of reason. This was an offer of peace, an unplanned holiday on an island of strange and simple folk. "All right, Malachi," I said, and I heard myself laugh. "You've convinced me. Thank you. You will enjoy yourself. Everyone is so very welcoming to our special guests." An hour later, I stood in a room at the Mariner's Rest. Martha was a woman with kind eyes and hands soft with dough, and she showed me to a room with a bed dressed in a quilt of many colors and a window that looked out upon the sea. I used the guest house telephone and called the precinct and told O'Malley I was taking my days. He grumbled at the wire's other end and spoke a word about me going native, and then he approved it. I unpacked the few poor things I carried in my bag, and I looked out from my window upon the island of Cormorant's Perch. The mist was breaking, and thin shafts of a pale sun descended through the pines. Malachi was right. I had judged this place with a mainlander's prejudice. I had allowed the ravings of a troubled child to color the world with a darkness that was not there. The islanders were not monsters. They were people wedded to their rock and to their old and peculiar ways, and I had been given the chance to witness it. I had set my foot upon a new path, and chose to believe it was a path of my own choosing. I woke to the cries of gulls. At the insistence of Malachi, was not charged for my lodging or my meals. Old Martha set out before me a breakfast of smoked fish, bread, and coffee. She moved about the kitchen with a solemn sort of care, her attentions not so much of kindness, but as of some duty she was called to perform. "The harvest is a joyous time, detective," she said, and her hand was steady as she refilled my cup. "A time for us to give thanks for the blessings the sea provides us. It is wonderful to have a mainlander here to share in it with us. It's been so long since we've had a guest for the festival." After the meal, I set out to walk the island. The paths were little more than lines scratched into the hide of the land, and they wound through a close press of pine and rock that was the island's heart. For hours I saw no people, and heard nothing but the wind in the high branches and the sound of my own passage. I came at last to the cliffs at the southern edge of the land, a sheer escarpment where the land gave up its claim to the world. Far below the waves hammered at the rocks, a constant and violent toil. It was a place of a terrible beauty, and the water churned like a great grey mill race of the abyss. Toward midday I turned back, and a smell drew me to the village, the smell of roasting meat, and the far-off sound of some music. The place had come alive with a purpose. They were stringing ribbons of garish color from house to house, and in the center of the square a great pyre of wood was being raised. Trestle tables of raw timber were set out beside it, long as the feasting tables of old kings. "A good day for a stroll, detective," a man's voice called. He sat on an overturned lobster pot, mending a net of deep blue color. I knew him from the docks. "It certainly is," I replied, and walked toward him. "Alex Harper." "Oren," he said. He offered me his hand, and the grip of it was hard. "Pleased to have you with us for the harvest. It's only right we show our mainland neighbors our truest selves once in a while." We sat and spoke for the better part of an hour while he worked. He told me stories of storms that had names like gods, and of the old feuds between the fishing families, and of strange fish that they pulled from the deep channels, things with no names on the mainland charts. His talk was filled with the island's traditions, of the hunger of the sea, and of the price of its bounty, and I listened as a man listens to the parables of a faith he does not share, but finds compelling. Later, I saw a woman named Brenna. She sat weaving a great tapestry, and upon it were the figures of islanders in a boat heaving a great net from a black sea. In the net were other figures, things that had once been men, their limbs set at angles of profound distress. "It tells the story of the first harvest," she explained, and her fingers never ceased their nimble and practiced dance, how our ancestors learned to receive the gifts from the deep, gifts that keep our people strong and hale through the cold winters. She looked up and gave me a serene and beatific smile. "Every festival, we welcome a traveler to share in the tradition, a custom passed down from the beginning, to honor the bond between the settled and the adrift." I looked at the grim tableau she was weaving and took it for their sacred history, and a strange thing to celebrate with such an open heart. That evening, I ate with Martha and 2 old sailors, whose flesh was too frail for the sea, but whose eyes still held the look of it. Martha served a thick, dark stew of roots I could not name, and a meat she called only island game, and would say no more of it. We drank a wine made from berries that grew on the rock, a thing of some potency, and it coursed in the blood like a warm and drowsy poison that smoothed the hard edges of the world. The warmth of these people, the welcome they offered up, it was a constant and disarming tide that pulled at the pilings of my own reason. As I climbed the stair to my room, the world seemed a simple place, and all the sorrows of the mainland were a distant country. I lay in the dark, and from the village came the slow and solemn beat of a drum, a sound like the beating of a great heart. It was the sound of a thing coming to pass, of a rite being prepared. I chose to hear in that sound a song of peace, and let the darkness take me. The morning broke grey and doleful, and the day of the harvest festival arrived under a sky of leaden slate, pulled low across the water. The wine of the night before had left a bitter sediment in my blood, and I sought to clear my head with a walk along the shore before the ordained celebrations of the evening began. I chose a different path this time, a track that led toward a cove of which Oren had spoken, a place of rocks and tide pools that the islanders called the Bunyard. "It's where the sea gives back what it has taken," he had said, and there was a knowing in his eye I had mistaken for charm. Whale bones, smoothed glass, shipwrecked timbers. The path was no path, but a scar through the gorse that descended toward a crescent of black shingle, where the sea foamed and fretted. The curve was a sepulchre of driftwood, a tangled ossuary of trees scoured and bleached to a bone whiteness by the salt and sun. I saw where the great rib of a leviathan broke from the sand, like the arch of a ruined cathedral. I walked the tide line where the last wave had laid its lace of foam upon the shore. I was soothed by the solemn and rhythmic hammer of the waves, by the cold and absolute solitude of that place. I bent to the shingle to retrieve a stone worn smooth as a palmful of worry when I saw it. It was a shard of unnatural whiteness protruding from the wet and sucking sand. I knelt in the dampness and worked it free with my fingers from the cold earth. It was not a piece of shell nor of coral. It was the distal phalanx of a human finger. There was no mistaking its morbid and articulate perfection. A coldness that had no source in the sea air entered into me, a chill from some other and more terrible climate. I stood and made to hurl it back into the water, to give it to the sea's forgetting, when I saw the glint of metal upon it, corroded and green from its long slumber in the salt, a circle of baser metal, a cheap and simple wedding band, still clung to the bone. My eyes courted the beach with a new and terrible attention. They were no longer the eyes of a tourist but of a hunter, or of the hunted, and in that desolate place there was a New Testament written in the debris, and I began to read. Half hidden in a great clot of rotting net, cast high against the cliff, was the shattered arch of a human mandible. It was yellowed with age, and a few teeth still clung to their sockets, save for one, which held the dull gleam of an amalgam filling, a small testament of dentistry, and a life lived on the other side of the water. I took a step back from it, and my feet turned on the slick stones. The boy's whisper returned to me, no longer a child's fever dream, but a truth spoken from the heart. They eat people from the mainland. My gaze fell upon the driftwood piles with a dawning horror, and that which I had taken for the ribs of seals or porpoises, I now saw with a new and awful clarity to be the staved-in architecture of a human cage. I saw a splintered femur that had been gnawed and broken. These were not skeletons, these were the leavings. This was the offal of a feast, the friendly welcome of the elder Malachi, the hearty parables of Oren, the strange tapestry of Brenna the Weaver with its figures pulled misshapen from the deep, the meat in Martha's stew, a thing with no name but with a provenance I now understood. All of it came together in my mind, a constellation of terror whose shape was now revealed. This was not a harvest of the sea, it was a harvest of men. I turned from that place of bones, and I ran. I clawed my way up the slick embankment, my hands gripping at the thorns of the gorse and at the wet and naked roots of trees, as if they were the hands of saviors held out to me from the living world. I burst from the ravine's edge and did not stop. I ran with the terror of a debased animal back to the false sanctuary of the Mariner's Rest, and a single thing was screaming in the meat of my brain. I must get off this island. I crashed through the guest-house door and fled up the stairs. I slammed the door to my room and leaned my back against the wood. My eyes scanned the small confines of my room. One door, one window that gave out onto the square. My training was not made for this. This was a heresy of the flesh, a pagan rite as old as the rocks it was enacted upon. My radio, with hands that would not be still. I retrieved it from my bag. I raised its small antenna and thumbed the switch and pressed it to my ear. There was no squawk of the dispatcher's call. There was nothing. I turned the small black box over in my hands, and I saw it. At the base of the antenna, the wire was severed, a clean and precise cut. Some careful artisan of my doom had been in my room, while Oren filled my ears with his parables of the sea, while Martha set out her stews, while I had walked in my ignorance among the tombs of their making. I walked to the window, and through a crack in the lace, I looked down upon the square. The spectacle of the festival was nearly prepared. The pyre stood mountainous in the dusk. The islanders moved about their work with the grim and purposeful industry of acolytes at their devotions. The smiles I had taken for welcome, I now saw as the ravenous and serene masks of predators. I saw Malachi directing the final preparations, a high priest in his element. As if he felt the weight of my gaze, he looked up from his duties, and his eyes scanned the windows of the guest house. Our gazes met and held for a long second across that ordained space. He gave me a slow and placid nod. It was a benediction. It was a final and awful amen, for I was not the guest. I was the honored guest. I was the harvest. I remained in that room while the last of the light bled out of the sky. My mind scrabbled at ways to escape. Swim to the mainland? I'd freeze to death. Steal one of their boats? The islanders' boats would be guarded as such upon this holy night. There was nothing but the clothing on my back. My only path forward was to play along. I poured cold and dead water from the pitcher into the basin and put my face in it. In the clouded and weeping glass of the mirror, I saw a ghost looking back. A pale face whose eyes held a terror I knew I must conceal behind some semblance of civility. I coached the pale man in the glass. You are just a visitor. You are eager for the festival. I descended the stair. Old Martha stood in the gloom of the lobby, polishing glasses. When she saw me, she offered up a smile of such grotesque welcome that it was a thing of surpassing horror. "Ah, Detective Harper, there you are," she said. "I was beginning to worry you would sleep through the commencement feast. You must be hungry. Go on, join the others in the square. The fire will be lit soon. Find Malachi. He has saved you a seat of honor." I contrived a smile. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Martha." Outside, the world had been remade by fire. Torches on high staves bled a guttering light onto the scene. The air was heavy with the sacramental odor of pine smoke and the rendering of fat from a massive pit near the fire. The islanders were gathered at long tables of rough-hewn timber, drinking from wooden cups and laughing a laugh that was not a sound of mirth, but of a ravenous and primal joy. A knot of men made music on fiddles and drums. I moved through them. Warren clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Almost time, Detective. You'll never see another night like this one." Brenna the Weaver smiled at me from the depths of some beatific trance. All of it was an act, and I the guest for whom this final act was prepared for. I saw Malachi then. He stood like some ghastly pontiff at the head of the main table, a crown of dark ivy on his white hair. He motioned me toward him, and I made my legs obey. "Alexander, my boy," he boomed, gesturing to the seat beside him. "I am so delighted you have joined us. I trust your day was illuminating." "Very scenic, yes," I managed. "Excellent," he said. He turned and raised his cup, and a sudden and profound silence fell upon that place. "People of the Perch, we gather tonight for the sacred harvest, as our forebears did, and their forebears before them. We thank the unending sea for the bounty it brings to our shores." A great and terrible baying rose from the assembly. "And we thank the drifting souls who find their way here," he continued, and his cold eyes found mine and held them, "who nourish our traditions and give of themselves so that our community may survive another year." The crowd roared, their faces a gallery of feverish and contorted masks in the firelight. They raised their cups to me, all of them, and Malachi turned to me, and in the din his voice was a whisper of venom and benediction for me alone. "It is a great honor you provide us, Detective Harper, the greatest honor we can bestow. You are now truly a part of our island story, forever." Platters of rendered meat and steaming roots were passed down the long boards of the tables. One was set before me, a charnel bounty piled high upon the plate, and I could not look at it. "First, you will eat with us," Malachi said, and his voice was of a silken and dreadful honey, but with a subtext of iron. "It is tradition that the guest partakes." They were going to wait until I was full and slow. I picked at the flesh with my fork, and the ghastly ruse was the only thing between my life and the pyre that awaited it. "Tell me, Malachi," I said, and I marveled at the steadiness of my own voice as it came forth from my throat. "The ceremony itself, when does that happen? What am I to expect?" His smile widened. "Patience, my boy. After the feast comes the music, then the dance. A spiral dance, winding to the very center of the square. That is where we show our ultimate gratitude. At the foot of the fire, under the moon." My eyes courted the square. The fire and the torches were the world's only light, and beyond their bleeding circles lay the utter blackness of the cliffs and the docks. It was the only way out of that lit and holy hell. Then came the dispensation, for which I had not dared to pray. A man burdened with a roasted leg stumbled, and his platter crashed upon the earth with a wet and greasy clap. A momentary confusion took hold as men rushed to this small ruin, and their bodies formed a brief and chaotic screen between Malachi and myself. My mind surrenders its claim, and my body acted upon its own terrible ordinance. I shoved the great weight of the table and sent Malachi's cup spilling its dark wine across his lap. He sputtered a curse. I was over the bench and into the shadows before the first cry went up. "The guest is leaving," a woman shrieked. "Don't let him reach the docks." The frantic music of the feast was strangled in an instant, and in its place there rose a bestial clamor and the percussion of heavy boots upon the hard pan. I ran as I had not run since I was a boy who feared ghosts in the dark, and now the ghosts were real and at my back. I ran through the warren of lanes and between the salt-eaten cottages, and their knowledge of the place was offset by the pure and animal fury of my flight. I hid myself behind a stack of cordwood and held my breath as two fishermen passed, their faces limned with a righteous anger, and then I ran again toward the sound and the smell of the sea. The docks. I broke from the last line of the houses and saw the harbor. A few boats sat tied fast in the black water, their familiar forms of no use to me. And then I saw it. Churning slow from the far pier was a light, and I heard the slow and steady systole and diastole of a diesel engine. It was a mainlander's boat, a trawler hugging the dark shore. It was my only hope. There he is. A roar from the blackness behind me. A clot of men bearing torches broke from the village, and at their head was Oren, his face raw, filled with the intent of murderous sacrament. They would be on me before I could reach the pier. I did the only thing that was left to a man in my extremity. I scrambled down the rock face at the harbor's edge, my hands shredded on the shells and the stone. I fell into the water, and the shock of such lethal cold seized the very heart in my chest, and I swam. I put my head down and crawled through the black and frigid water, my strength a coin I spent with every stroke, my arms reaching for that single receding light. The shouts at my back turned to curses and then to silence. They did not follow. They were content to commend my soul to the sea's cold ministry. The sea did its work. My limbs were things of lead, and my lungs were filled with fire. And as the last of my strength left me, as I prepared to give myself to the deep, my flailing hand struck something hard and unyielding. The hull, a rope ladder hung down its side. With my fingers I hooked them through the rungs, and I pulled myself from the water and came to be on the scaly and reeking deck of the boat. I collapsed and drew air into my lungs in great ragged gasps as the lights of Cormorant's Perch, the lights of that ordained and hellish feast, dwindled to a fading constellation of malevolent light upon the black and endless waters. And I was alive. The fishermen who pulled me from the black water looked upon me as if I were a shade dredged up from the sea floor, a thing not meant to return to the world of men. He gave me a blanket that reeked of fish and salt and the great and abiding rot of the ocean, and pointed the nose of his trawler toward the mainland's distant lights. I offered a broken telling of a boating accident, and he did not question it, for the animal terror in my eyes was a testament older than any words. In the clean and well-lit rooms of the station house, my story sounded like madness. They listened with the concern of men who hear a confession for a sin they cannot comprehend. I gave them my testimony. Finn's whisper, the charnel ground of the cove, the sabotaged radio, my flight from that ordained feast. They sent a Coast Guard chopper to circle that rock. The report came back and said everything was normal. A fishing village, quiet people. There was no proof, for this evil was a thing that left no proof, only a profound and terrible absence. Sergeant O'Malley was a bull of a man whose faith was in the solidity of the world, and my story was a heresy against his church. Hypothermia, exhaustion, he declared, his voice a sermon for the bullpen. Couple that with some of their home-brewed poison, and you hallucinated the whole damned thing, Harper. Get a grip. For a week I sat in that purgatory of paperwork, and every time I closed my eyes, the world dissolved into the grey shingle of the cove and the pale and horrid glimmer of bone in the sand. Every shadow wore the face of Malachi, his smile a placid benediction upon my damnation. I was a man who had seen God's monstrous other half, and they called me mad for it. Then on a morning, like any other, the telephone on the main desk rang. I saw O'Malley emerge from his office, reading a slip of paper, and his face was a study in irritation. "Unbelievable," he said, and he stopped at my desk. "Get this. Another domestic complaint from your precious island getaway." "Sir?" I asked, and I rose from my chair, though my legs were made of straw. "Noise complaint. Boyfriend and a girlfriend this time, apparently. Some young couple named Thorne, just moved over from the mainland 6 months ago, looks like. Neighbor is reporting yelling, screaming, the whole 9 yards. Standard procedure," he said, turning toward a rookie named Peterson, a boy so young his piety for the badge was still upon him. "Peterson, you're up." The air went out of me. "Sergeant, no," I said. "No, sir, you can't." He turned back, and his brows were a furrowed and angry line. Can't what, Harper? Can't do my job? Can't send an officer to a simple public disturbance call? You don't understand, sir. It's a lure. It's not a real dispute, I said, stepping toward him. It's how they do it. It's how they get someone out there. First my call, now this one. Don't you see the pattern? You can't send him. Detective, that is enough, he said. You have your own conspiracy theories, that's fine. Deal with them on your own time. But you will not interfere with police business based on some fever dream you had. Peterson is a capable officer. He doesn't carry your baggage. He gave me a last look of dismissal. Now get back to your desk. He turned his back on me. The sentence was passed. I returned to my place, and I watched as Peterson, young and doomed, and eager to prove his worth, grabbed the keys to his patrol car. And Peterson, O'Malley called out to him, "It's the perch. No sidearm. Just keep the peace." The boy gave a nod full of a terrible and unknowing confidence. He cast a look of pity upon me as he passed, the sane man pitying the seer, and then he walked out into the light of the day. That was 3 days ago. Peterson never activated his radio. The rock has gone mute out there in the grey expanse of the water. He has not come back, and I know with a dreadful and certain gnosis that he never will. The great and terrible wheel has turned, the old blood sacrifice is paid, and the harvest is come again. And I, who had seen the awful workings of the oracle, was now just another soul damned to watch it happen.